So medical assistance in dying has been legal in Canada since 2016, and the legislation has recently been amended. Have you ever wondered who's eligible and what the process entails? Today's presentation will provide a brief history of how MAID came into law, outline eligibility criteria, as well as the application and assessment process, and also describe what is next for the existing legislation. Our presenter tonight is Bina Feldman. Bina has worked in the field of adult education for over 30 years. She was the principal of her own company delivering training and development seminars nationally and internationally. Bina is a retired professional trainer, consultant, performance coach, and keynote speaker. And she's pleased to be part of the Dying with Dignity Canada and making a contribution to educate the public about MAID and advanced care plans. Later on, we'll hear from our subject matter expert on MAID, Mary Anne Cecutti. And Mary Anne is a retired healthcare consultant and a chair of the Greater Toronto Area chapter of Dying with Dignity Canada. She's currently building the chapter with passionate, like-minded individuals whose goal is to inform and educate the public and other stakeholders in our community on MAID and MAID-related topics, as well as advocating for improved access to MAID. She's also a volunteer independent witness for those seeking MAID and a researcher for the National Office of Dying with Dignity Canada. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter for this evening, Bina Feldman.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to put up the presentation. Can you see it now?
We can, yes.
Great. Thank you for inviting us to talk to you about a very important subject, one that's near and dear to our hearts. We're living in strange times. Everyone will agree. When we're hearing reports of dying and death in unbelievable numbers in countries across the globe over this past year, in cities across Canada, in our neighborhoods, among our friends, and for some, even family members. Thankfully, those numbers have gone down recently, but internationally, it's still abysmal. Dying and death has certainly been in our thoughts a lot during this global pandemic. My mother died at the age of 101, and she played bridge on her second to last day. She often said to me, Bina, you have to be lucky in life and lucky in death. And she was one of the lucky ones. We all know that not everyone is that lucky. She talked to me about death from time to time, and she told me she wasn't afraid to die and that I shouldn't be afraid either, that it was a natural part of life. And I'm so grateful that she shared that wisdom with me, and I can share it with my children. It's time we all started to talk more about dying and death. The objective of our presentation this evening is pretty simple. So if you remember one thing, and one thing only out of everything I'm going to say this evening, I'd like you to remember this. If you have knowledge of the options available to you, you'll be able to make informed choices in your planning and decision-making, and ultimately you'll have more control of your end-of-life situation. So knowledge of your options will give you choices, and choices will give you control. What are we going to cover this evening? Let me share the agenda. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our organization, Dying with Dignity Canada, and what exactly is medical assistance in dying. How did we become legal? What's new? There's been changes to the legislation recently. If you've been reading about it, I'll explain that in a little more detail. And what's coming down the road. And then we'll be welcoming your questions, which Mary Anne will answer after our presentation. Dying with Dignity Canada is a human rights charity. We started in Ontario, and we grew to a national organization which now boasts over 2,500 members. What do? We defend human rights by advocating for assisted dying rules that respect the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In 2020, we celebrated our 40th anniversary, advocating for the right to choose how and when we die. We receive no government funding. We're fully privately funded by individual Canadians who believe that they have the right to die with dignity. In a recent Ipsos Reid poll, over 85% of Canadians supported MAID for those who meet eligibility criteria. And I'm going to talk more about those important criteria presently. What's our focus? Our focus is fourfold: eligibility, access, support, and education. We're committed to protecting end-of-life rights, improving the quality of dying, and helping Canadians avoid unwanted suffering. With regard to eligibility, we ensure that assisted dying legislation in Canada complies with the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. With regard to access, we work to ensure that Canadians can access MAID in compliance with the Constitution and the Charter. With support, we support people, their families, their caregivers, medical personnel, as they explore all end-of-life options, including MAID. And we lead educational initiatives such as this one here this evening to inform citizens and healthcare professionals, whoever wants to learn more about end-of-life options, including MAID and advanced care planning. So we do this by, let me just go back a minute. We do this by intervening in the courts related to anything around Bill C-14. Bill C-14 was the legislation that allowed for medical assistance in dying. We work to ensure that doctors who object to MAID refer their people who ask them, refer them to other doctors who will give them the information they're seeking. We provide information, education, and personal support and resources to anyone who's interested in MAID. What exactly is MAID? I've been throwing that term around, so this is the legal definition: the administration of a substance by a medical or nurse practitioner at the person's request that causes their death, or the prescription or providing substance to a person, again at their request, for self-administration to cause their death. These are the definitions. This is the definition we'll be working with. How did MAID become legal in Canada? Well, these three brave women paved the way. Some of you may remember Sue Rodriguez. She's the younger woman at the top. In 1993, Sue Rodriguez was 42 years old, suffering from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. She took her case to the Supreme Court of Canada, and she asked the court, "If I cannot give consent to my own death, whose body is this? Who owns my life?" The Supreme Court deliberated, and they upheld the Criminal Code division in a very close call, 5-4. So ultimately, it still was a crime to help someone with their own death. That was 1993. In 1994, Sue Rodriguez took her own life with the help of an anonymous physician by ingesting a combination of morphine and secobarbital. Fast forward 20 years and we meet another two very brave women who fought on behalf of all Canadians for the right to die with dignity. The bottom left was Gloria Taylor, who also, like Sue, suffered from ALS. And on the bottom right, Kay Carter, who suffered from degenerative spinal stenosis. Regrettably, neither of these women lived to see the fruits of their labor. Kay Carter was able to access assisted death in Switzerland in 2010. And Switzerland was the only country that allowed non-citizens the right to access-assisted dying. And Gloria Taylor died of a severe infection in 2012. But let's look at the court case, because Kay Carter took her case to the Supreme Court. And on February 6th, 2015, the Supreme Court released their decision in Carter versus Canada, and they determined unanimously this time. In 1993, remember, it was 5-4, but this time it was unanimous that the prohibition on assisted dying infringes on individuals' rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. And so the resulting MAID legislation was Bill C-14, and it came into law, as Richard said, June 2016, which really was not that long ago. Since June 2016, over 13,000 Canadians have accessed medical assistance in dying to relieve them from intolerable pain and suffering. I said that over 85% of Canadians support MAID for those who are eligible. So eligibility is a very important criteria. It's all about safeguards. And the decision to seek MAID is not taken lightly, and these criteria must be met. So these are very important. To be eligible for MAID, first of all, you have to be eligible for publicly funded health services in Ontario, which we know is OHIP. Aside from being 18 years of age, you have to be mentally competent, meaning capable of making your own healthcare decisions. You have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. That's written into Bill C-14, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. It's quite a mouthful. You have to be making the request voluntarily. So those who are assessing you must understand that you're not under any pressure to pursue MAID and that there are no signs of coercion. And lastly, you must be able to give informed consent prior to the procedure. You must be aware of all medical options available to you so that you can ultimately give your final consent and that you're fully competent and aware of what you're saying and doing. Let's go back to this term grievous and irremediable. It requires some more explanation. So in order to have a grievous and irremediable condition, you must be suffering from a serious illness, disease, or disability, and be in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. You must be experiencing intolerable physical or psychological suffering from this disease, and you must be in a state of decline that cannot be relieved under any conditions that you find acceptable to you. And your natural death has to be reasonably foreseeable. So I put the term natural death reasonably foreseeable. This is in red because it really warrants more discussion. What does naturally reasonably foreseeable really mean? Well, before I get into that, I want to introduce you to two Quebecers who are very important to this whole topic. Jean Trouchon and Nicole Gladue. In 2019, not long ago, these two Quebecers challenged the criteria of a natural death being reasonably foreseeable as a criteria to apply for MAID, and they took their case to the Supreme Court of Quebec. And the Quebec court ruled that the need for a reasonably foreseeable death in order to access MAID was unconstitutional. And the federal government accepted that decision. As a result, they drafted Bill C-7, which was a further amendment to the criminal code, and it broadened the eligibility of those people who were seeking MAID. And not long ago, you may have been reading March 2021, so just a few short months ago, it was in the press a lot. Bill C-7 received royal assent and became law. And so what did that mean? Now in Canada, we have two groups who are seeking access to MAID. One group whose death is reasonably foreseeable, as originally outlined in Bill C-14, and one group whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, as determined in Bill C-7. So let me explain this a bit more. First of all, reasonably foreseeable death, let's take a step back and look at this criteria that originally appeared in Bill C-14. It was a very ambiguous legal term, and it was difficult for doctors and nurse practitioners who were doing the assessment to actually interpret the term. It resulted in the medical community finding it difficult to understand the intent behind this criteria. What were the issues? Well, first of all, it excluded chronically ill Canadians who were suffering intolerable pain and enduring suffering. And secondly, it created inconsistencies around access to MAID, depending on the person assessing the individual, and if they determined that the death was reasonably foreseeable or not. So that all changed when Bill C-7 became law. Those whose death was not reasonably foreseeable did have access to a MAID assessment. These are very important safeguards, so I want to go over them in this chart so that it's really clear about what these safeguards are. On the left-hand side, you'll see a column, a vertical column for those people whose death is reasonably foreseeable, and the right for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. So the first subset is written request. This whole process starts with a written request. The person whose death is reasonably foreseeable has to have been told that their condition is irremediable. They must be told of every available means to relieve suffering, including palliative care. For people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, they have to have been told of every available means to relieve suffering, including counseling services, mental health services, disability support services, community services, palliative care, and they must be offered consultations with all professionals who provide all those services. And their doctors must agree that all alternative means to relieve suffering have been considered. So it's quite robust. Secondly, there are two medical assessments involved in the assessment for MAID, and I'm going to be going through that in a moment. And those two assessors have to be either a doctor or a nurse practitioner. In the case of people whose death is reasonably foreseeable, no expertise in their condition is needed. But for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, one of those assessors has to have expertise in the person's condition. So in the case of Jean Touchant, one of the assessors had to have expertise in cerebral palsy. If neither assessor has expertise, then a third assessor must be brought in. In terms of waiting period, people whose death is reasonably foreseeable don't have to wait at all after the two independent assessments. But for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, there's a 90-day reflection period after the first assessment. In other words, the procedure cannot be performed until after 90 days. So the waiting period is substantial. In the case of people whose death is reasonably foreseeable, final consent can be waived. They don't have to say anything at the very end. But for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, they do have to give final consent before the MAID procedure is administered. So these are safeguards we really wanted to emphasize in our presentation this evening. Let's look at how the MAID process actually rolls out. It starts with an initial inquiry when someone goes to their doctor or nurse practitioner and asks about end-of-life options. And the medical provider must inform them of all treatments available to them and palliative care and MAID. The response to that request must include the option of MAID. Now, what happens if your doctor doesn't support medical assistance in dying? If your healthcare provider doesn't address MAID as an end-of-life option because of their own personal beliefs, then they are compelled in Ontario to refer you to a medical practitioner or to an agency that will give you the information you're looking for. They must provide an effective referral to an available physician or agency that's willing to help you with your request. After the initial inquiry, a written request must be filled out, and that can only be filled out by the person who is seeking MAID. Another person cannot fill out the request. In Ontario, it's called a clinician aid A form. There may be some other forms in certain hospitals, but that's the primary one, clinician aid A form. And the request establishes your eligibility to proceed with the process, that you're capable of making this request. That means that you understand and have a clear understanding of your medical condition, and you've been informed of all other treatment options, including palliative care. The signing of this request must be witnessed by an independent person, and there are criteria for those independent witnesses. Now, what happens if the person requesting MAID is physically unable to sign? Then a third party who also must meet independent criteria may sign on your behalf. Making a request for MAID doesn't mean you have to go through with it. You can stop the process at any time, right up until the last minute. And that's a very important point that I want you to know. The assessments. I mentioned that there were 2 independent assessments. So a doctor or a nurse practitioner will meet with the individual to determine if their condition is grievous and irremediable. They'll have an extensive interview. They'll go through all the medical files, and it may be one meeting, it may be more than one meeting before they determine eligibility according to the criteria. After they've determined eligibility, an independent second practitioner, either a nurse or a doctor, comes in and performs that same assessment procedure all over again. And you remember that if your death is not reasonably foreseeable, one of those assessors has to have expertise in your condition. Now, for those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, there is a 90-day waiting period, as I mentioned. If you're not happy with the conclusions of these 2 assessors, then you can bring in a third assessor. You can even bring in a fourth assessor. You can have multiple assessments. Once the 2 assessors agree to your eligibility, the procedure of MAID is scheduled. The medical practitioner, whether it's a doctor or a nurse practitioner, issues a prescription, and they pick up the drugs that are needed on the day MAID is to be performed or self-administered. Prior to administering the drugs, the person receiving MAID is asked to give final consent for the procedure to the doctor or nurse. This can be a verbal consent. For some people, it might have to be nonverbal. And they can say, I've changed my mind right up until the very end. And that's okay too. If consent is given, or in the case of those people whose death is reasonably foreseeable, if consent has been waived, the drugs are administered for a quiet and very peaceful death that is not at all painful and takes about 10 minutes. Death is pronounced and the certificate of death is issued. For those who want more personal stories, you can go to our website, Dying with Dignity Canada, and read some of the blogs from family members who describe a very peaceful death, surrounded by loved ones, surrounded by what's important to you. And they've written their stories, and some are very heartfelt and give you a real understanding of what this final procedure is like. So that's the rollout of the process and how it goes. I want to tell you now about Audrey Parker. In 2018, Audrey Parker lived in Halifax. She was suffering from stage 4 breast cancer that had metastasized to her brain, and she chose a MAID death. She really wanted one more Christmas with her family, but she was afraid that she wouldn't be mentally competent to give final consent if she waited another month until Christmas, because she knew that because the cancer had metastasized to her brain, she was losing her mental capacity. And so she chose to die in November before Christmas. She realized that there was a flaw in the law, and legislators realized that also. So in Bill C7, we have something called Audrey's Amendment, which is a waiver of final consent. And that means that if you applied for MAID, your death was considered to be reasonably foreseeable, and you met all the criteria, you could set your death at a later time. And even if you weren't able to give final consent, that would be okay. So you had a waiver of final consent. And that's Audrey's Amendment in Bill C7. What's coming down the pipeline? Well, there's going to be a comprehensive review of MAID legislation over the next 2 years. Now, because an election has been called, that review is somewhat in limbo right now. We're hoping that regardless of who forms the next government, they'll be back on track with looking at some very important priorities in regard to Bill C7 and MAID legislation. What are the critical issues that are going to be explored? Well, mental illness as the sole condition for applying for MAID is going to be under review, and the government will hear from experts and develop safeguards so that protocols for people falling into this category will be established very carefully. The other priority is something we call advance requests. Right now, if you suffer from dementia, early onset, you cannot waive consent to have MAID at a time when you won't be able to recognize anyone. We're hoping that the government will approve advance requests so that if you have early onset of dementia, you can say at a time in the future, if I no longer recognize anyone, or if I can't care for myself, or whatever criteria you establish, you want a MAID death, and you won't have to give final consent, because people with dementia cannot give final consent. A third priority to look at are safeguards for people with disabilities who have enduring pain and intolerable suffering, and safeguards will be explored for that group. And the issue of mature minors, defined by law as a person under 18 who's capable of providing consent, provided they have the intelligence, maturity, and capacity to understand the nature and purposes and consequence of such a decision. So these are just some of the topics that we hope will be picked up again with the establishment of a new government. Let me summarize some key points from this presentation, some key takeaways. First of all, MAID is your right as a Canadian. It's important to know all your end-of-life options, so that you have control of your end-of-life scenario. Only you can request MAID. Nobody can request it for you. And if you do request it, you can withdraw that request at any point in time. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The more we participate in writing the end of our own story, the more satisfied we are with the arc of our life. MAID allows for planning, being in the place you want, surrounded by the people and the things that you want at the end of your life. It's a very reassuring process, and it's a comfort to both the family and the friends and the individual. MAID has been described by those present as being very peaceful and very comforting. At Dying with Dignity Canada, we believe that everyone has the right to choose a good death. Thank you. I'll pass it over now to Mary Anne.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bina. What a wonderful presentation that was. Such a professional and clear presentation, I believe. Some very difficult information there to, there's a lot of levels to it, but certainly the presentation, I think, made it very clear exactly what the criteria is and how that each level, each track is treated differently, and that the safeguards that are in place are very clear, and that I hope everyone has been edified by the information that's been provided. So I would like everybody who's listening, I hope everybody's there, please come off mute and give Bina a big round of applause for her presentation this evening.
Thank you.
Now we have questions. Mary Anne is going to be our subject matter expert this evening here, so she's going to be fielding most of the questions. So if you have a question for Mary Anne, then please put up your hand, whether it be the virtual one that's available on your reactions or participants menu, or just a friendly wave, and I'll pick up any questions and direct them appropriately. So, okay, Karen, why don't you go ahead with the question this evening?
Okay, I'm wondering if I should let Edwin go first, because I have like a three-part question.
Oh, I don't know.
I have a quick one.
Yeah.
Okay, sure, Edwin. Give us a quick one, and then we can, as a warm-up, and then we can go over to Karen. Go ahead, Edwin.
A quick one. I've been taking notes here. I missed the number of people who have availed themselves with MAID. What was the number again? What was the figure?
The number in 20,000. Pardon?
Since 2016?
Since 2016 to 2020, it was about 13,000 Canadians.
13,000.
And that accounts for about 2.5 of all the deaths in Canada.
Okay, was that your only question, Edwin?
Now, the reason I'm taking a few, yes, that was one of the things I missed. The reason I'm asking certain questions, I have a column with a Filipino-Canadian newspaper, and I intend to bring this topic up in one of my columns. So I took some notes, and hopefully I'll be able to get some more details later on. I'm sure it's available on the internet and through Google, etc.
There's an excellent report put out by the Canadian government that I shared with Richard. Richard, perhaps you could forward that to Edwin. It's the second annual report on MAID in Canada that would have all the statistics you need around MAID. And do you still have that, Richard, that you could forward?
Okay,
yes, I'm just posting that to the chat now, Edwin. So have a look in the chat.
All right, thank you.
Okay, why don't we go to Karen now? Go ahead, Karen, with your three-part question.
All right, thank you very much. Bina, excellent presentation, very clear, very logical flow. So congratulations, well done.
Thank
very
you.
Enjoyable. Okay, so the situation is my 95-year-old mother, and she does not fit the grievous medical issue category, but she has multiple small medical issues. Then she broke her hip, etc. She has labile hypertension. Anyways, lots of little conditions. And she just really doesn't want to live any longer. And she's been asking me about MAID, and I'm wondering how far you think we've gone in terms of these assessors actually realizing that quality of life is really important, and my mother is never going to get better. It's only a downhill slide to either Alzheimer's or total blindness because she has macular degeneration. So that's like the path. So I guess the question is, what are the chances of someone like my mother, who's considered healthy in the eyes of the medical community?
I think you will find that if you pursued it in the route of assessors, the assessors are very compassionate. One of the key things is that it isn't intolerable. The suffering is intolerable to you.
To her.
And Richard will also be circulating a sheet of resources for you as participants this evening. And you'll see one of the resources there is the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers. Excellent group that can help you connect with assessors in your area, and perhaps assessors that are more open to looking at your mother holistically.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In their assessment for MAID.
Okay. And the other kind of stumbling block is these doctors. My mother's family physician is young. He's not a Canadian-born physician. And every time my mother tells them, like, I'm tired of life. You know, every time I come to you, there's another problem. You know, you didn't catch the fact that I had like a total blockage in my legs and I had to go for surgery. And I really don't want to survive. I don't want to go on. And he just says, you're going to live to be 110. So does she now need this family physician to sign off? Or you're saying I can go directly and she can go directly and fill out that clinician aid A4 form?
Absolutely. And
okay.
again, as I said, CAMP, excellent resources and can put you in connection to doctors who are more open to MAID and exploring that with their patients. There's also a link to the Ontario government, and they have access to referrals as well. This is the whole thing about that effective referral. If your mother goes to her doctor and says, you won't talk to me about MAID, I want you to refer me to somebody who will. He's bound in Ontario to do that. And if he doesn't, there are other routes she can pursue to get someone who can help her.
Okay, thank you very much. And by the way, I donate to MAID, Dying with Dignity. I donate to Dying. So you're doing a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Before I come to you, Edwin, I'm going to ask a couple questions that have come through the chat. And just as a reminder, if there's anybody that would like a copy of the resource list that I'm going to send out, and I don't have your email address, if you're not one of the frequent flyers in this group, then please put your email address in the chat and say either resource list, or if you'd also like to be on the Halton Peel Humanist Community distribution list, then you can put your name there as well. Just indicate which list you want to be on, or both, and we can do that for you, certainly. So there's a couple of questions that have come in from Elka and Charles about MAID. And the first question is MAID, for insurance purposes, considered a natural death?
That question always comes up. Yes, it is. The cause of death on the death certificate is always the underlying condition that prompted MAID, and the insurance companies accept that. So it doesn't invalidate any insurance.
Right. And the other question is about reasonable foreseeability, probably the top two questions you've ever been asked. How long is reasonably foreseeable?
Again, this is quite dependent on the assessors. I mean, there are many conditions that the prognosis is very reliable, even in certain cases of dementia. They know what the path is, the clinical path is going to be. So again, there's always that interpretive part, as Bina alluded to in her presentation. The doctors and the nurse practitioners doing the assessments struggle with this themselves because it is such an ambiguous term. Is reasonably foreseeable weeks? Is it days? Is it months? Is it a year? What is it? So it becomes open to the assessors. I mean, quite often when somebody gets a terminal diagnosis, their specialists will say, well, we expect you to have 6 months to live or 3 months to live. And there are persons who die very quickly before that time. And there's other people who defy the prognosis and are still living 4 or 5 years down the road. So it's a hard call. And as I said, dependent on the assessor's interpretation. And they're also going in depth into your medical records in their assessments. So, you know, that's part of their professional opinions in making the decision.
Okay, and certainly I imagine that the sort of because the assessors and the primary care physician, they're putting their reputation somewhat on the line to be doing this. They have to feel comfortable in the process as much as everybody else does, so that they can complete the process in a way that they preserves their own integrity. Correct?
Absolutely, and you, as Bina also alluded to, the requirement is for 2 assessors, but there are cases where the 2 assessors don't agree. One says you meet the eligibility requirements, and the other one may say, no, I don't think you do. Nothing precludes you from getting a 3rd or 4th opinion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mary Anne. All right, we have one more question from Elka and Charles, but we'll come back to that in a second. And before we do that, we'll go to Linda. Linda, do you have a question for Mary Anne?
Yes, I do. Hi, Mary Anne. And
Hi.
Bina, excellent presentation. Very clear and very simple. I like that.
Thank you.
Okay. Actually, I got lots of questions anyway. Let's say I'm well, like I am, right? But I want to do like a living will or something like that, where I say if I, let's say, get into a car accident, I wind up blind or paralyzed or whatever, because these things happen, right?
Mhm.
Could I set up a will in such a way that I could have all the like preconditions saying if I get into an accident, don't revive, don't revive me, or if you do, I just don't want to live with being blind, or I just don't want to live with having a severed spine or whatever it is. Can I set up something like that?
You can make what's called an advanced care plan and lay out those things. Unfortunately, at this point in time, you cannot request MAID as part of your advanced care plan. That is something that the statutory reviewer, the parliamentary review, was looking at when it was called the advanced request, which meant if you set out certain criteria, that you could say, if these criteria are met, I would like to receive MAID. You can't do that at this point in time. What you can do at this point of time is make an advanced care plan that lays out things about not receiving certain extraordinary health measures if certain things happen to you. But you also must have a substitute decision maker, because your wishes in an advanced care plan are there when you can't speak for yourself.
Okay.
So that's a whole other presentation.
Oh, okay. And if I were to set something up, would I have to go to a lawyer to do that? Or do the people in your organization, like a volunteer, would be able to spend time with me and set that up? Or how would I work? How would I start the procedure in doing that?
There's an excellent toolkit on the Dying with Dignity website that you can
Yeah.
work through yourself. You don't have to do it with a lawyer. You do not have to name your substitute decision maker with a lawyer. But the important thing is that it's available to people around you who know what your wishes are, your family, your substitute decision maker. So the toolkit is a very good start to take you through the whole process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Linda.
Okay.
We'll go to Kelly now. Kelly, you have a question for Mary Anne?
Hi, Richard. Yeah. First, I think what your organization does is very important, and so thanks for doing what you're doing. Does the death have to happen in a hospital setting?
Absolutely not. You can arrange to have your MAID procedure done wherever you would like. It's the beauty of it. You can orchestrate it. You can have who you want there, where you would like to have it. Foods. I mean, there was a very interesting article in the Hamilton Spectator about a gentleman who had his buddies over. They watched a football game, had a few beers. Then he had his procedure in his favorite chair. You know, the sky's the limit within the confines of your provider as well, and the availability of your provider. But people, you know, have pets present, whatever music you like. The only time that I believe it has to take place in a hospital is if you have donated organs, if you wanted to go down that route and you qualified to donate organs.
Right. Makes sense.
Just because of the process for organ donation. But other than that, wherever.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. We have a question from Cameron now. Cameron, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you. It was very, very touching. I appreciate it. I wanted to get in my question now because actually I wanted to ask about, I would like to donate my organs to science or transplants. And so I was wondering, Mary Anne, if you could go into a little bit more what the procedure is to do that and also access MAID.
I would send you to the Ontario Trillium of Life, Gift of Life people. They can go far, they know far more about this than I do, because a lot will depend on the underlying condition that you have. And what organs you're looking at donating, depending on your underlying condition, what organs could they harvest. There's an excellent CBC documentary on GEM called Her Last Project, which is about a doctor in Halifax who wanted to donate organs. She had a neurodegenerative disease and qualified to donate organs, and what she went through in her last days and to receive MAID. And it's quite interesting, but I would direct you to the Trillium Gift of Life here in Ontario to answer all your questions about that, because I certainly am not an expert in that field at all.
Sure. I appreciate the resource. I'll take a look.
Okay, thank you, Cameron. We have a question again, another question from Elka and Charles. They were talking about track 2, which is the track for people whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. So how long does the process take on average for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable?
Well, at minimum, 90 days. Much longer, again, depending on what the underlying condition is and whether or not they can demonstrate that they've gone through those criteria of researching what's available to them, and again, that it's not acceptable to the patient. That's the key determinant. So if I've gone through all this and it is not acceptable to me, anything that's out there, and I have my first assessment and I'm approved, the clock starts ticking then. So it could be as short as 90 days. It might be as long as a year or two, depending on the individual's situation. So what I always advise people is, if you're considering MAID and you do have an underlying condition, as with palliative care, the earlier you start exploring your options, the better.
Right, because certainly there is, in the case of the 90-day waiting list, that is, as you say, I think there are a couple of circumstances under which that can be lessened, but in general, that's going to be 90 days. And of course, you can extend it out from there as long as you'd like. Once you reach the 90 days, if everything is going fine, you can continue on indefinitely within that after having approval.
Of course, if your situation deteriorates to the point where you no longer are not reasonably foreseeable and you've become reasonably foreseeable. I think you're familiar with this, Richard, with the legislation prior to C7, there was a 10-day wait period for people who had a reasonably foreseeable death. And the assessors could waive that 10-day wait period if loss of competency was expected within that 10-day, because again, there was no waiver of final consent. So if there was a possibility of you losing capacity within that 10-day wait period, the providers often would let you do the procedure, or would do the procedure before the end of the 10 days. So there is wiggle room in there.
Yes, that's true. and I think that that's very important to know, that essentially that the process is in the control of the assessors themselves within the provisions of the legislation, certainly, but that, you know, they are sympathetic and empathetic to people's situations. They're there as, patient-centered providers of health. And so working with them and having a close working relationship with those assessors is a very important part of the process.
Exactly.
Okay. Linda, did you have anotdo question, Linda?
Yes, I did. You mentioned that, with this setting up this thing online, right? The what do you call that again? Where you set out conditions of where you don't want to be revived or whatever?
It's an advanced care plan.
Thank you, the advanced care plan. Now, I don't know about you, but I find computers very intimidating, and I don't know, what I mean? So is there volunteers in Mississauga, like, who would, let's say, if you go to the office, that they would answer your questions?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you.
On your resource, there are actually staff members who you'll see at support at Dying with Dignity Canada, and they'll be able to answer any specific questions you have. The advanced care plan kit you can print out and do it all by hand. You don't have to do it online. It's all hard copy if that's what you need.
Yeah, I just want to know, like, let's say I'm confused by the wording because I'm real dumb in things like this. And like, I could have a person in your organization go through it with me and set it up so it's done the right way.
I'm sure they will be able to help you, if not themselves, to direct you to somebody who can.
Okay. And let's say, I'm going to give you a hypothetical here. Let's say I have a condition and these bloody assessment people say, no, you're not ready to die yet, whatever. Then would your organization, let's say hypothetically, be able to mention a country that would take me in and allow me to die at dignity? If let's say I have early, let's say the early stages of Parkinson's or something, I'm just saying, I don't want to wait until I get the bad stages, like, and the Canadian law says, no, you have to wait until you're like in a wheelchair and going blah, 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 right?
Well, This is all
Let's-
about the relationship you have with the assessors and providers. The only country that allows non-residents to access medical assistance in dying is Switzerland. And again, I can't at this point tell you what all their criteria are. But you will find the assessors and providers extremely compassionate. And it's not, they enter into relationships with their patients. So it's not a one-off, let me do a checklist and yes, no type thing. Often if someone doesn't qualify with your example with Parkinson's, it might be maybe too early at this point, but they will follow you until it, again, the key is what is unacceptable to you? What is causing your suffering and pain? It's you, because I can't. I mean, somebody could cut off my finger and I'd go, well, that wasn't too bad. And somebody else could get a pinprick at the end of their finger. And they'd go, oh my God, so much pain, there's so much pain. You can't judge that. Each person is going to feel things differently, and that has to be taken into consideration.
I see. Okay, that's great. And how about so another question. Sorry about this. I'm asking lots of questions. When they start doing the stuff about the psychological, right? Let's say someone's been suffering depression for 50 years, and they say, I've tried everything. I've tried drugs. I've tried shock therapy and whatever. I'm just depressed. My body is healthy, but my life is just shitter in the shitter. And I tried everything. So when would they be having a decision on that? Because you mentioned they were mentioning mental health stuff.
Right. It's a non-government advisory group that's looking into this right now. They have thankfully not been, their work hasn't been suspended because of the election call. So they're continuing with that. In March of 2022, they're to deliver their findings to the parliamentary committee and outline a process that will allow people with the sole underlying cause of their request for MAID as mental health to be able to pursue it. So by 2023, March of 2023, this process has to be in place and open MAID to people with mental health conditions as a sole underlying cause of their requests.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Now, Mary Anne, I wanted to ask a question about that question. Did you say that essentially there will be some sort of legislation in place to take care of people who have mental illness as a sole underlying condition by March 2023, that's not something that will be decided upon either way? It's just deciding upon the specifics?
Yes, Bill C7 has excluded people with mental health issues as the sole underlying cause for 2 years. So they've got to get their act together in the next 2 years and have a stringent process in place that will allow people with mental health issues to apply and be assessed as to whether they are eligible to receive MAID. I mean, I anticipate it's going to be very strict and very stringent, and a lot of hoops will have to be jumped through. But the legislation was very clear that they would only be excluded for 2 years.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good news. Thank you very much, Mary Anne. Okay, we've got a question from Karen and also Edwin. We'll go to you in a moment, Edwin. But first off, we've got Karen. Go ahead, Karen.
All right, so I apologize if I missed, I think someone asked a similar question, but if after the 90-day waiting period, you're approved for MAID and you choose to delay it for 1 month, whatever, for whatever reason, does one have to restart the same process of assessments?
No. Short
Okay.
answer is no. Once you're approved, there's no expiry date on that.
Fabulous. Thank you.
It's just setting the date, right? And even then, people have been known to set a date and they're still feeling well or better than they expected, and they move it out a little bit farther.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no, great question, Karen. Thank you. All right, Edwin, you've got another question for Mary Anne?
Oh,
Okay, go ahead, Edwin.
Okay, I have a couple of two questions. The first one is probably a quick one. What is the percentage of out of that 13,000? What's the percentage of the non-foreseeable death? Of
those
that
numbers,
13 of that
those
13,000 deaths?
those numbers haven't been collected yet because it's only, that group of people have only been allowed to access MAID
Okay.
since March of this year. So there are no numbers at that. So far, I only know of one, which was Jean Truchon, who actually received his MAID procedure before Bill C-7 came into law. And again, he had to go to the courts to ask for the procedure to take place before the law was passed in Canada.
Okay. My other question, okay, you want to finish what you were saying?
No, that's all I
Okay.
had to say on that.
I'm interested in what the church is saying about all this. I imagine there must have been some lobby against this process. What have you heard? And I'd like to hear the details.
The Catholic Church is very vocal in their dissent on MAID. Other fundamentalist Christian groups, other religions, depending on the congregation, and I'm sure that's true with the Christians as well, are quite supportive of it. We did a presentation for Bina's temple a few weeks ago, and her rabbi is very, very supportive of it. So it varies, and I would have to say from congregation to congregation, regardless of the religion.
Okay.
And Edwin, I just sent the resource list directly to your email, so that might answer any other questions for your good background for your article.
All right. Thank you.
I
Okay.
mean, it's difficult, I think, when you get into the question of religion, because everyone sees it differently as far as, you know, if you view MAID as a very compassionate, gentle way to help somebody, or your views are that only God can take a life. And, you know.
I imagine, if I may say so, I imagine a Catholic choosing MAID will not get any extreme unction from his minister. That's number one. Number two, is it fair to conclude that a lot of MAID advocates are atheists?
No, I would say not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I don't know, Richard, you may be able to speak to this, but in our witnessing experiences, it's just a whole breadth of religions and varying degrees of their, I can use the word devotion. It runs the gamut, but for the most part, I would say, in my experience, the people that I've witnessed for, they've been very spiritual people. For lack, you know.
They ask for the ministers to administer something before the end?
I'm not involved in that, so I really can't say. I know that there's an issue in some religious hospices in that where they don't even allow the assessments on property. There was a big case in BC because all the hospices were run by the Catholic Church, and even though they were publicly funded. And the Vancouver chapter went to the government, and they were able, it was either stop funding if they won't allow MAID, because this is a right in Canada, and they won. So.
Yeah, maybe just a bit of background. As Mary Anne did reference, I've witnessed the MAID applications for quite a few people, and I'm surprised, always surprised, at just that that there's no commonality between who is seeking MAID and making applications. It's an even mix of people, of men and women. There's no real difference between the genders there at all. There's certainly there's people from every walk of life, different ages. Certainly, every medical complaint that is possible within those cores, and I don't know about spirituality based on our context as a humanist meeting here, but certainly everybody has a very similar idea in mind that they would like determination and autonomy over their own lives, and that that even if their views on everything else are very private, they're always very clear about what they want in their own lives, and they're always very thankful that there's an organization, especially like Dying with Dignity, who can act as some sort of advocate in these cases, because sometimes they're going against some societal wishes within their own quarter, and possibly even within their families. There are discussions. But everybody that's involved, they are very clear in their own minds about what they want from their own lives. They've made those wishes very clear to their family, and their family has come around because they've seen that this is the life that they want to leave, and this is the decision that they've made. And so that's what I've found in my experience.
I'm going to have to say goodbye because I have another commitment now, but I just want to thank you for inviting us and wish you all the best.
Oh, thank you very
so
much, Bina. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, excellent,
Very.
excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
We'll be wrapping up shortly here. We've just take a couple other questions. Linda, do you have another quick question for Mary Anne?
Actually, okay, got it. Actually, I was going to ask you and Bina, like you're dealing with a very tough subject here. This is more about you rather than my question. And I was wondering, do you find, like, how do you dealing with this subject all the time? Because death is not a very cheerful subject. And I'm thinking, how do you psychologically deal with seeing all these people who are suffering, or their families who are suffering, or having to battle like the Catholic Church, or, you know what I mean? It's just a tough subject to deal with day after day after day. It's almost like, as tough as being a police officer in some ways, because you're seeing this very, very, it's not an easy subject.
No,
so how
it's
do you
not
deal with it?
I think we deal with it by having conversations like these and getting information out to people. Very much to reiterate what Richard said, that it's your choice, and regardless of what your religious beliefs might be, you have the importance of that information and having these conversations. It's not going to be right for everybody.
Yeah,
but there are conversations that need to be held. I think as far as the witnessing perspective, the fact, as Richard said, once you finish witnessing for someone, how thankful they are to you for helping them. It's very rewarding. I'm a proponent of choice.
Yeah.
And what is it that's right for you? And everyone's going to choose something different. I mean, there are people who start the process of MAID and never go through with it. And that's a statistic, people in palliative care. There's a larger percentage of people in palliative care who go through the process of requesting MAID. They're not quite sure why, whether it's just they're better educated on what resources are available to them or what. But also, there's about 2.5% of the people who apply for MAID never go through with it. And we believe that part of that is just it's sort of like an ace in your back pocket, right? If I decide that things are getting too bad, I can act on this. I may choose not to. So it's that element of control and knowledge, sort of our Venn diagram that we put up at the beginning. If you know what's available for you, you can make choices and you can be in control. And we all like to be in control.
Yeah, I think you misunderstood my question. I wasn't asking about the people. I was asking about how you deal with it. Let's say after you get home after a day of work, so to speak, and and you're with your family, and like how do you deal with this yourself?
Well, first off, I'm a volunteer, and it does not consume every waking hour.
Okay, that's
cool. So I find it very, very easy to deal with because I feel that I'm helping people by providing information for them or assistance in their path to seek MAID.
Okay, another thing I was going to say is excellent. You answered my questions excellently, and I want to thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Edwin, we'll end up with you. One last question for Edwin.
Okay. Well, I'm just curious if this is being talked about in our high schools. I wonder how it's being handled, if it is. Is this part of social studies, part of Christian sociology? I wonder, Mary.
I couldn't answer that question, though. I was approached by a high school student earlier this year who is doing a project on it. So I think at that level, it's mostly a result of family members who've had experience with either grandma, grandpa, aunt or uncle has chosen MAID, and the family's been very open about it and had these discussions. And that's where they're getting their information. It's not a group that we're targeting at this point to share that information with. It's
so,
mostly
you're not aware whether it's
our demographics
become part of any subject or course.
It's talked about more in at the university level, ethics.
Because my internet is unstable.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's more post-secondary groups that are getting into the discussions about this.
Mary, thanks very much. And Richard, thanks for organizing it. And the other lady has left already. Thanks so much.
Well, you're welcome, Edwin. You're welcome.
Okay, well, that's too.
Fantastic. So thank you very much. There's a lot more education that has to go on here. Certainly, I've been amazed through my participation with Dine with Dignity, just how many people are not aware of the rights that people have within
No.
Canada to access this in any way. And so there is a lot of education that needs to happen here. And it is a tough subject. Not a lot of people don't want to have these conversations at all, but it's certainly a large societal change that Canada is going through here. But I think it's definitely for the better for a lot of people, to alleviate their own suffering and that of their friends and relatives as well, to choose to die with dignity. So again, I want to thank Mary Anne Cecutti for being here this evening. I want to thank each and every one of you for showing up to our presentation. We will hope to provide you many more wonderful opportunities like this in the future. And in fact, Dying with Dignity has an advanced care planning presentation also available. And so if you're interested in that, please let us know, or we can come back to you and discuss that as a future presentation for Halton Peel Humanist Community. So without further ado, we're going to thank you for coming this evening. Of course, if you would like to support us, hp-hc.ca, and you can become a member at various levels and help us in what we do and present wonderful, worthwhile, educational and topical presentations such as we had tonight. And we promise that for the rest of the year, we'll be having some other wonderful presentations like this one. So stay tuned to Meetup, Facebook, or the website, as I said before. And thanks for coming out. And everyone, again, take yourself off mute if you would. Give us a big round of applause for Mary Anne's question and answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us and listening to our